Tenim... Millor ara. Super, gràcies. Com sabeu, avui tenim a la Helen Pritchard, que farà una xerrada que en part és continuació de les activitats que hem estat fent i coordinant des d'Engar dins el marc de la Biennal Ciutat Oberta. Ahir vam estar fent també amb la Jara Rocha un workshop en Engar que moltes de vosaltres veu participar i que esperem que continuï donant moltes idees o punts d'apertura, que es titula Queering Damage. I avui tenim aquí a la Helen Pritchard, que és artista, geògrafa, investigadora i professora a Goldsmiths i que treballa sobretot en els espais de trobada, no sempre des del consens, de les estètiques computacionals, de la geografia, el disseny i diria que una mena de revisió transhack feminista de la tecnociència. I bueno, com sabeu, també ens hem solapat amb una multiplicitat d'activitats, també amb l'Octubre Trans, però de fet tenir a la Helen aquí és tenir una presència a l'Octubre Trans d'una altra manera, potser no aquí a dos carrers, però amb certes connexions. I en el marc de totes les activitats que estan passant a Barcelona aquests dies, també volia aprofitar per recordar que ara tenim un superfestival de pensament i de filosofia, en certa manera, que està portant a figures molt importants a la ciutat de Barcelona, però a la ciutat de Barcelona durant els últims anys també hi ha hagut un festival de filosofia i de pensament amb la intenció d'obrir el pensament crític a la ciutat, que era el Barcelona Pensa, on moltes companyes han estat treballant i fent molts esforços també, a vegades en condicions precàries, i diríem que això, com a mínim des de la nostra perspectiva, és la condició de possibilitat de moltes coses. I fins aquí, només ja per últim agrair al MACBA aquesta col·laboració també per poder fer la xerrada aquí i sobretot a l'Alicia Escobio, que ho ha fet tot possible. Així que, Helen, benvinguda i endavant, moltes gràcies.
Great, so I just want to start as well with a bit more thanks. Thanks to Hanger for the invitation, and also thanks to MACBA for hosting the talk tonight, to the IRB Barcelona, which Hara Rocha and I visited earlier this week. And I'd also really like to thank Hara Rocha and Laura Benita Valero for collaborating with me over the past few months in planning the workshop that we held, a kind of collective workshop at Hanger yesterday. Okay, so I want us to start here, to think about the differences that are here. In the coastal regions, an anthropological curiosity emerges. Glowing electron layers are dense around the locales of intense polyaromatic hydrocarbon, polychlorinated biphenyl records. We study chemical sentiment, software, and bioinformatics against two plateaus, anthrocasts over which our principles become unstable. Can you work it? Can you work it? Put your thing down, flip it, and reverse it. Moving through tiny cellular structures and chemical envelopes that contradict each other, we brush up close to rocks, to proteins, to compressed traces. We had a queer feeling, and it wasn't love, actually. A transgenic fish falls in love with a computer. A computer falls in love with a transgenic fish. A feminist geographer falls in love with the asthmatic, luminous woman in Pirano, whose breasts emit a blue glow. A transgenic fish from the past goes into suspended animation and winds up either becoming a canary in a mine or taking Donna Haraway's place at a critical juncture. This is the scene. A computer travels back in time. A dolphin falls in love with a computer. A computer falls in love with a dolphin. A computer falls in love with a computer. 2 Earth dolphins are launched as cosmodolphins in the cyberspace of a dream machine, of the computer 61, and wake up in the future as a feminist geographer, engaging us in a felt sense of causality. Okay, so in this research talk, I'm going to try to talk about some of my ongoing attempts into what I really see as a queer intervention into environmental computation. And it's part of this project, the Animal Hacker. And by environmental computing, I'm really referring to the practices such as measurement, sensing, and calculation of environments that form a kind of bioinformatics and environmental practice. So my engagements through empirical and practice-based research seek to kind of bring attention to these scenes, really in which computation, nature, non-human animals, microbes and other critters become mobilized and figured, scenes of environmental computation. And really what's kind of core to this work is, rather than taking the approach of designing for non-human animals, instead it's a kind of inquiry really into thinking with the endurance of non-human animals with networks. So the way in which non-human animals are held in enduring states of kind of partial survival, really. And to kind of think through how this might be a kind of becoming with, through affect, with computational ensembles. And so I want us to kind of think about this as a wish to engage in what Elizabeth Povinelli describes as developing otherwises. So how we might collectively devise a kind of computing otherwise. So the Animal Hacker is a project really that is kind of concerned with the politics of participation in computational systems. And in really particular ways, the way in which a kind of queer or feminist or poetic approach might be a way to kind of revolt against the narrow imaginations of computing and the environment. Because these imaginations, as we're going to see later in the talk, often limit non-human animals as kind of inputs, as a kind of computational input, or a host in which computational processes might take place. So in a way, it's a kind of process of getting to grips with what's happening in these contemporary entanglements of capitalism, computers and environments, within the kind of context of the Anthropocene, in a way that we might reimagine a more affirmative type of entanglement between biotic subjects, between organisms, and computation, and how kind of creative practice might make this into a type of open-ended inquiry. And in particular, I kind of really held close this notion from Lauren Ballant, that queer, socialist, anti-capitalist work has really all been about multiplying the ways in which people have lived and can live, so that it might be possible to take up a number of positions during life in order to have a life. And that, in a way that might not be repressed by a kind of dominant or conforming mode of normativity. So trying to think across into queer theory and bring that into a kind of more than human or non-human realm. Really to think through these questions of what it might mean for non-humans within these computational infrastructures to have a life, because that's not always possible. So the Animal Hacker really wants to bring attention to how non-human animals are, through often their participation with computation, sometimes constrained and sometimes propelled by their entanglements. So I wanted to just start with taking us back to the 1970s, to this exhibition in software kind of quite famous exhibition in the history of software art. And as some of you probably know, as part of this exhibition, there was this fantastic piece of work from Nicholas Negroponte with the Architecture Machine Group. And in this piece of work, they installed a tank full of gerbils within the exhibition. And the artwork, which was called Seek, consisted of a very, very large computer infrastructure that took up quite a lot of space, a robotic arm, and a perspex tank that was full of small wooden blocks that were inhabited by gerbils. And the gerbils and the robotic arm would continuously change the position of the blocks. So the gerbils would be kind of busy building their houses, and the robotic blocks would be kind of changing that arrangement. So as the labouring gerbils arranged the blocks into structures, the robotic arm continually broke them down and rearranged them in a specific mattering pattern. And if anyone's ever owned a gerbil as a pet, they're quite particular about how they arrange their environments. So they became more and more kind of frustrated and angry about this computational life, this computational process, this life in a computerized environment. And they began to attack the robotic arm. And they didn't stay kind of separate for very long. They very quickly became entangled. They came together as the gerbils quickly encrusted the robotic arm in their feces, right? So they're kind of all over it. And this caused it to malfunction, and it remained broken for the rest of the exhibition. Obviously, this was kind of part of a cybernetic imaginary, and almost 50 years later now, the scope of the cybernetic imaginary really extends its practices to quite a world-making scale when we start to think about the relationship between computers and non-human animals. And through these kind of ever-accelerating practices. So from things such as genetically engineered organisms that are designed to work with computers, to the way in which social media might be generated. There's an environmental computing process that seems to stretch out beyond the lab, beyond the exhibition, encompassing the internet and other digital information networks. So when we think about this type of environmental computing, kind of, what's happening here, and it is a very broad kind of definition that I'm introducing here to you. So it might cover everything from sensing the Earth by satellite, things like climate change modelling, even human citizens monitoring environments, big part of environmental computing, big data practices, and then other types of microbial practices, along with things like protein modelling, toxicology work, and so on. And so whilst environmental computing is a very big field of research and practice that stretches out beyond science and into other fields, in particular, I've been really kind of interested in how we might really kind of focus in on the scenes where computing comes together with non-human animals, fish, and microbes. So kind of what's happening in this thing of environmental computing where animals and fish are really kind of part of that infrastructure. Scenes in which animals are both represented by computing, but also often contribute to them, or a kind of a creative force that propels those practices into being. And in particular, I've been very interested in, obviously there's a kind of promise of environmental computing to repair or to make reparative steps in the way that climate processes take place, or to kind of generate information so that we might be able to not get poisoned, or so that we might be able to think about how we can change the process of climate change. But often those environmental computing processes are for a particular who, right? So they might be protecting some, but harming others. And I think that's a really, for me, a very important political part of the project is thinking, in these processes of environmental computing, who is this process for? Where are the harms? Where are the protections? And so I've been interested in thinking about how we might consider environmental computing, perhaps not as measuring or writing the other, but instead about these entanglements with non-human animals. And by non-human animals, kind of referring to animals, organisms that are not human animals. So this kind of provokes a question, very much kind of informed and inspired by Donna Haraway's work of how we might speculate, imagine, feel, build something better. So I very much see, although the project is dealing with harms and injury, that it is a kind of affirmative project, and it really is also coming from the place of myself as a practitioner, trying to think about how we might build something better or speculate about something better. And then, of course, we have to ask better for whom, right? Okay. So, additionally, a really kind of big part of the project is that this intervention that I'm proposing on environmental computing is, in a way, kind of queer intervention, a way in which queer feminist technoscience might kind of move outside of what might be normally bounded as environmental computing within the designated fields of study. So there's a kind of unruly use of environmental computing in my work. And also, queerness itself is also something that can't be kind of packed into a tidy vessel in its approach. So, as Jesper Puar kind of notes, queerness really challenges a kind of mode of conduction and transmission. And there's not an exact recipe for a queer endeavour. It's not something that is tidy and can be defined. But instead, it's a way to perhaps trouble what might be normally done in these fields of work. And for me, there's really a kind of urgency here about how we sustain and proliferate environmental computing. It might not be something that perhaps some people in this room have considered before as an important political project. And sometimes I have to remember that. But in a way, what I think is urgent here is that environmental computing is really framing what nature is, what environments are, and what gets to count in policy and politics. So how might we sustain and transform environmental computing for the here and now? How might we propose a computing that might be formally and politically oppositional? How might we make a computing that resists closure? And how might we also make space to think about the real environmental harms that are taking place? So I'm also not suggesting that somehow these computing practices are kind of inventing things like climate change. I think we can all agree there are some serious environmental harms taking place. And so in other words, how might we, as Octavia Butler says, uphold a politics for queer survival, right? How can we also survive within these scenes? And this has really been a kind of driving force of the Animal Hacker project. So before I kind of continue into a particular part of the research, I thought maybe it might be kind of useful for me to explain how I got to this place of thinking with the Animal Hacker. I was doing a lot of work in a kind of DIY technology practices, thinking about who gets to participate in technology practices, engaging with things like DIY citizen science or DIY computing, and really thinking kind of like how a feminist approach to computing might widen up that participation. And so as part of this project, I began a residency in an environmental database. So it was a project where they were setting up lots and lots of sensors on a farm to monitor environmental processes. And they wanted to have an artist in residence to do participatory work with some of the residents in this village in Cumbria in the UK. And really the project started as a kind of DIY science project, and I was considering how we might open up the participation in both designing the project but also dealing with the data. But as I kind of carried on the project, it seemed to me that there was actually a whole other set of participants that started to draw my attention. And some of those had more than two legs. And In particular, there was a really important moment where one of the scientists, we were driving home one day from a meeting at the farm, and I was saying, I think there's like another type of participant that seems to be in all our discussions, but we often aren't accounting for here, and perhaps, that might be the direction of this participatory project. And so she kind of called me the next week. She said, I think you need to come to my office because I think that you're going to find something that's really interesting. But I can't write about it as a scientist because actually it's kind of wrecked our project for this particular part of the monitoring. And so what they were doing is the scientists were monitoring the pollutants in the river and trying to work out when pollutants would rise and when they would fall and how they could make changes to the farm infrastructure to kind of create better water quality for the area. So as part of that research, they were monitoring the animal movement in the farm, so the cows and the sheep, and when they moved, and if they entered the river, if that made a spike in the pollution, or if it decreased the spike in the pollution, or if there was some kind of relationship they could trace. So they had set up cameras for 6 months on part of the river, and they took an image. It was an automated remote sensing project, and they took an image every 30 seconds or every minute. And they had done this for 6 months. And they knew that the sheep crossed the river because they came from the farm, they crossed the river in the morning, and they crossed the river when they went back in the evening. But when they downloaded the photographs, actually 6 months later, which I always find quite strange that they waited 6 months to download the data, but when they downloaded them, they looked like this, right? They hadn't managed to capture one moment where the sheep crossed the river. Somehow, the sheep had completely resisted the computational infrastructure that had been laid down to monitor and survey them. And there was one image, there were a few images where sheep were either side of the river, but there was one image where one sheep was just dipping its toe into the water. But apart from that, a completely, by their sort of standards, empty data set. But this kind of accident was also kind of fascinating them. And it's really seemed a kind of very interesting moment to think with. For a start, why had the scientists and we all assumed that the sheep would be compliant to be monitored, right? But also, what does that mean when non-human animals are resisting infrastructures? It suggests perhaps that there is a relationship there, that it's not just a neutral scene in which you can monitor these movements of the sheep. The kind of camera was affecting the context. So for me, as a kind of moment, this was a very important situation in which, I thought actually we need to kind of slow down here in this participatory project and think about what's going on here. And Laurent Ballant, the philosopher, has a kind of great note that, there are some situations that have a kind of rise and fall of intensities. And they really provoke the need for us to adjust, to slow things down, to gather up, to find things out, to wonder and to ponder. And often these are scenes where things feel on the verge of something, and that might be a dissolving, a snapping, a wearing out, something that's overwhelming, underwhelming, or just different, just kind of unpredictably different. And for me, this scene was very much a scene like that. And so I was very much kind of drawn to ask this question of kind of what's going on here, and to think about this affective engagement with the research. And it was very much a moment in which the research kind of bathed me in an emotion of kind of creative dissonance. It was a strange situation to encounter. So that's kind of how the project kind of shifted from thinking about human participation to actually thinking in a much more precise way about kind of environmental participation, environmental entanglement with computing, non-human animals' entanglements with computing processes, and kind of what we might do about that. So as part of this research, I investigated ethnographic and through ethnographic work and also speculative engagements. In particular, and this is a part of the work that I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the talk, is living sensors. So non-human animals who are either designed or labour because of their particular bodily processes, as sensors in environments. And more, they are very deeply entangled with computational infrastructures. And by computational infrastructures, I'm kind of referring to digital networks, server farms, computers, microchips, softwares, hardwares, and their longer tails. But of course, like perhaps it's useful here for us to kind of linger on some other living sensors that are a bit more graspable than these microbial sensors. So of course, non-human animals have kind of long been really overburdened with the task of making sense of human social relations. And many critters, many non-human animals have been enrolled as sentinels in environmental sensing. I'm sure that many of you have come across these. And they've been enrolled in order to detect signs of disturbances that remain indiscernible to humans. So they're kind of enrolled to make something that we can't discern immediately more present to us. So canaries, mollusks, lichen, rabbits, as we saw in the previous slide, have all been tasked with these quite heavy jobs as sentinels. Sentinels that can signal future events or warn us about our environments. And sometimes as well, these sentinels have resulted in new techniques, so making it possible, for example, to lower the thresholds for detecting toxins in oil and air, soil, and water. And so they haven't just been a kind of passive participant, but very much kind of limited to their sentinel role. Of course, a very famous example of a kind of living sensor kin is the canary in the mine. And the canaries were first used in the coal mines in the UK from 1911, because although they had originally thought they would use mice as a sentinel to pick up the toxicity levels that could be dangerous to humans, which might need the miners to leave the mine. When testing, they realized that canaries became very distressed, and they would sing when they were distressed. And this was exploited as a kind of early warning system. However, this was quite a complex entanglement, and while the birds were working, they were often treated as kind of trusted pets by the miner, so there was a kind of affective relation who would coax them or whistle to them. And this picture is on the day when the canaries were officially retired from the mine, right? So they kind of come up from the mine, liberated perhaps. So as part of the research, I've been thinking about these living sensors, things such as transgenic fish that have been engineered to monitor water quality, or microbial chips that can signal oil toxicity. And although these biotic subjects are engineered, they're slightly different perhaps to the canary in the fact that they have much more entangled with a design process in which their kind of bodily functions are altered in the lab in order to behave in a particular way. They do kind of follow that trajectory of the sentinel, something that through a harm to itself can express a kind of signal or a warning to humans. And this is one of the living sensors that I've kind of been engaged with. It was a transgenic fish that was designed to illuminate the pollution in the Hong Kong harbour. And the way that this fish has been designed is that their bodies produce a kind of array of light when they become into contact with plastics that might disrupt the endocrine hormones. And of course, that disruption produces a kind of reproductive protein. And that reproductive protein has been labelled or kind of tagged with this fluorescent gene, which is originally from the glowing jellyfish. But actually, this is probably a synthetic gene that it's been tagged with. So in a way, these transgenic fish, and they're not loose in the Hong Kong harbour, this is a kind of media imagination of them. As they become touched by material waste and the toxins of late capitalism, production and consumption, this flows through the bodies of the fish. And this fluorescent protein emerges, and it causes their liver to glow, it causes reproductive hormone. So as these photons of light touch the water, they kind of create a spectral transformation that then is envisaged. It can be read by a kind of computational process. But they're one of the organisms that I've engaged with and thought through their processes of. But today I want to talk a bit more about the critter chip, which was another living sensor that I became introduced to whilst working in the toxicology lab in Hong Kong, researching the transgenic GFP. So the critter chip is a living sensor, but at the microbial scale. So it's not a fish body that is signaling change, but it's a microbe. And critters on the chip were originally developed at the Oak Ridge Laboratory in 1997, very much as a kind of response to the Exxon oil spill. And, scientists were trying to think about how sensing could take place in environments that were quite dangerous for humans, and perhaps could go and be kind of hardy surviving sensors. So although the critter chip was developed in 1997, and then it was a really kind of like a small, tiny, light-sensitive computer chip coated with bioluminescent bacteria, so the same glowing gene was in the bacteria or a similar one would glow again when it was exposed to a process that would injure it or harm it. And so although this was a kind of, in some ways, a kind of speculative vision in 1997, today there are hundreds and hundreds of critter chips that we kind of coexist with within the kind of network infrastructure that we're not often aware of. And these chips, they kind of focus, they activate in the presence of targeted substances, whether that's from petrochemical pollution, or other types of pollutants. They're often always used a lot in remediation in mining setups as well. So they kind of have a really quite deep relationship with fossil fuels and fossil fuel production. And they're also, back in the 1997, it was also a kind of speculative prototype, a kind of fantasy of a future technology that might be an imagined or effective scene that was emerging from the kind of scenes of extraction, pollution, and computation. So after I've kind of talked a bit more about the critter chip, I'm also going to introduce this artwork, Critter Compiler, which is an artwork that I developed to engage and kind of think through some of these questions of microbial computing. Because as part of the research, I was interested in how I might mobilize a kind of what Rosie Brodotti describes as a non-profit experiment. So what might a non-profit experiment in microbial computing be that could actualize the virtual possibilities, and this is to quote Rosie Brodotti, of an expanded relational self that functions within the nature-culture continuum. And so the Critter Compiler project perhaps might ask us, the artwork, to consider what kind of creative or flourishing alternatives there might be to what I'm going to outline now as a kind of injurious mode, kind of damaging mode of computation. And I'll want to linger before then to think about how we might think about queer theory's insistence on damage and injury. So that's just to say that there might be some hope. It's not all going to slide into damage and injury, just to preempt that for you. So the critters on the chip, and here is a kind of image of the one of the critter chips. As I said, was really developed in the response to the Exxon oil spill back in the 90s, a kind of large oil spill that took place. And it's a live bacterium. It's cemented using latex and other adhesives onto silicon chips, and it eats and digests toxins that are harmful to humans. But as the toxin harms its metabolic system, it emits a blue-green light, and this can then be transmitted to a signal and be received through a kind of networked infrastructure. So it's through the kind of mode of injury that it signals something. It was also patented to be fixed to the back of the honeybee. So we could kind of think about this as a type of mobile, digestive, harmful computing. Unlike Haraway's account of Oncomouse, very kind of famous account of the first patented mouse for that was commercially patented, the kind of Life Inc. The critter chips, I think, in a way, they're kind of unremarkable. So Oncomouse was remarkable because Oncomouse was the first patented, commercially available mouse for lab testing. However, even though they're not the first and they're not the most famous, I think that what's going on here demands our attention because these microbial critters are these really kind of enduring subjects with their entanglements with computation. And perhaps like us, they're kind of enduring subjects within late capitalism, and they're not the first and they're not the most famous. And as I said before, they're one of thousands that we're kind of in this shared ecology, really, of care and suffering. So in the toxicology lab where I was researching, I was standing with the lab manager that I'd been working with at the Hancheng Labs, Vincent. Vincent is standing near a rapidly spinning centrifugal machine. He explains that he is working on a personal research project, generating bacteria for a microbial chip that will detect oil and petrochemical waste from refineries and factories, such as those in the Pearl River Delta, the low-lying area surrounding the Pearl River estuary. Today, Vincent is attempting to harvest the genetically engineered bacteria cells that will live on the silicon bed in the microcontroller. He draws a picture for me on the back of his pad. He shows how the critter chips will shimmer in vast floating networks, signaling in real time metabolic and reproductive processes as they respond through injury to oil spills. These signals translate the critter chip's injury from toxicity into iterative arithmetic computation. The critter chip is imagined as an input and output, generating metabolic reactions that produce output quantities of proteins as a function of the input of hydrocarbons. It's through this process of writing and compiling code in the bacteria's DNA that it is possible for iterative constructs to be implemented based on a clocking mechanism. These loops allow it to be repeated again and again as long as the conditions are true, as long as there is a signal of light or the presence of a toxin. It will continue to execute or emit light until its sell-by date. In this spectral vision, as the petrochemicals from industry circulate, they appear as these glowing traces, illuminated by the metabolic processes of microbes. The shimmerings here are literal and material affective variables, the patterning of data, the patterning of toxicity. Whereas the critter chips from the 90s were imagined in operating in kind of small mesh configurations, the critter chips in Vincent's lab will operate in huge networks, hub nodes that collect and aggregate data using machine learning algorithms. And it's in these sites of computation that are at the edges of human perception where much of this process takes place. As I leave the lab that evening and during my return the next morning, I find myself caught within and approaching the entanglements of critter chips as instruments of difference, arrested with the theoretical metaphors that open up the possibilities of going on the discourses of repair and environmental computing. Yet I am also caught within the very different lived experience of the critter chip and their use as a semi-living microbe that really has one possibility towards injury and death as a component in which a computational process might take place. So here we can see the critter chip is both a kind of promise of repair, but it is also a particular limitation of the microbe's life. And if we think about, if we go back to the Berlant, thinking about how we might multiply the possible ways in which we live and can have a life, It seems perhaps in some of these microbial computing entanglements, there's a particular kind of limiting of life of what that microbe can be. It's kind of the chip. So in Vincent's speculative scene, these critter chips are enrolled as part of a computational ensemble that produce this glow to make intense the most harmful, yet unknown, unquantifiable, unrecognizable, unmatchable traces of waste, specifically so that they might re-enter capital circulation as data. So they kind of make intense and make present these harms so that they enter into capital circulation. And as the chips spin on the machine and the bench, I'm left to wonder what's being brought into play by this kind of temporal or immaterial dimension of matter. And it's at these scenes in which this is taking place that we can think about what I've come to term as a type of toxic execution. So execution is the process of kind of running a program or executing code. But very much the critter chips, there's a kind of double bond of execution taking place, right? There's a double bond of injury, of microbe execution, but also computational execution. So critter chips are small and they're rugged and they're designed to be deployed in groundwater. And the critter chip back in the 90s was very much reported as part of a cyborg imaginary, what was called the Frankenstein pack, which included things like robo-eels, monkey brains wired to control robotics, moth antennae that might sniff out explosives. And they were very much framed as something that might gobble up toxic waste, as if that process was kind of perhaps enjoyable or pleasurable to the critter chip. However, the imaginaries of these critter chips that monitor other, these processes of gobbling up toxic waste, or they gobble up toxic waste, in landscapes that's kind of inaccessible to humans. For me, this kind of became a bit reminiscent of the Czech mockumentary film Ropaki. I'm not sure if anyone's seen that film. It's a kind of incredible mockumentary film that follows a group, a biochemist, a zoologist, and a filmmaker, as they seek out and study the Ropaki, which is translated as oil gobbler. And you can see the little oil gobbler there. Oh, it's a little bit pixelated. The oil gobbler there on the edge of the coalfield. The Ropaki lives in the brown coalfields in the documentary of northern Bohemia, and it has an endless appetite for plastics and all petrochemical derivatives. And the scientists attempt to rescue, so they kind of go on this mission to find this Ropaki, this non-human entity, and their kind of mission is to rescue it from the toxic landscape. However, of course, as they remove her from the fumes, much to their distress, the Ropaki dies. Her existence, much like the critter on the chip, is very much dependent on petrochemical pollution. So what the scientists fail to notice is that Ropaki not only gobbles up oil, but is a witness to the human exploitation of the coalfields, but is also kind of deeply entangled and kind of interdependent on the coalfield and the toxicity itself. However, unlike the kind of vivacious Ropaki who frolics, reproduces, plays in the coalfield, seems to be having a pretty good time, the experience of the microbes that are cemented to the critter chip, I want to suggest is not a copaceous or kind of co-flourishing experience. But the critter chip, unlike the Ropaki, in its interdependence with toxicity, is a kind of drawn-out persistence that precedes death. And the critter chips kind of emphasize the crucial yet elusive interactions of non-human organisms in contemporary computational execution. Non-humans who accompany us as perhaps negative shapes in computation and what I'm terming this toxic execution. Okay, so we'll leave the nice Ropaki there. So, consequently, and as a kind of queer experiment, instead of of focusing on a co-flourishing of humans and non-humans. My work in thinking about this term of toxic execution, I want to pay attention to the damage, the injury, and the constraints that are placed on the possibilities of life that are brought about through computation. And I guess a lot of the very important feminist technoscience work has actually been about thinking through co-flourishing of humans and non-humans. So if we think about Haraway's kind of amazing work with Cayenne, it's very much a kind of co-flourishing. And perhaps, on a whole, as researchers, we've been less drawn to kind of doing extended work with perhaps these more dark arts. And here, that's why I think it's very useful for us to think about this genealogy of injury in queer studies, because it becomes quite a useful way to think about a kind of willingness as feminist technoscientists to investigate the darker aspects of experience. And there I'm quoting Heather Love. And as the kind of Halberstam's antisocial turn in queer theory outlines, to queer something is to engage with both the powerful negativity of punk politics, but it's also a mode of crafting alternatives with others. And so I want to kind of extend these queer theories that concern personal injury into these more than human ensembles of things like the critter chips, so that we might be able to consider the damages that we share with non-humans in our entanglements of computation, petrochemical production, and capitalism. But as I said earlier, kind of drawing on queer theory is not an anti-affirmative stance. So it's not a kind of stance without a kind of wanting for a kind of change or perhaps some hope. But instead, as Heather Love outlines, there's this kind of emphasis on damage in queer studies exists in a state of tension between the need to resist damage to survive, but also the need to kind of affirm a queer existence. So to think through affirmative questions of resistance, we need to perhaps think about how computational processes constrain life, and perhaps this might push us to start somewhere else rather than the kind of economy of life and non-life, which we've perhaps engaged with previously, theoretical work, but instead to think about this relationality between devices, apparatus, entities, where entities are perhaps kind of like bound to particular types of survival or harm, right? So like how is that kind of part of their binding or entanglement? And indeed, I think, there's a kind of interesting thing here that non-human animals and queers share in a particular relation to bioanalytics or being part of also bioinformatic processes. And in that kind of both non-human animals or critters often become perceptible and determined through computation, specifically at moments of maintenance, management, surveillance. And I think it's important to note that although these are moments of maintenance, they're also kind of effective scenes. And through bioinformatics, the metabolic and sex processes of microbes or of transgenic fish become included through the maintenance and management, through the generation of data, as part of a kind of capital flow. And so I think there's a kind of affinity there. Okay, so how might we speculate on the ensembles of microbial organisms and computation otherwise? The critter chip, as I said, is a kind of microbial life that exists for its capacity to injury. But as the biologist Lynn Margulis evidenced, microbial life really kind of plays a unique role in establishing the biosphere and its kind of continued prominence in Earth processes, not least by currently signaling climate change, right? And also kind of microbes, if you think about things like algae, they're kind of a queer organism in a way, the way that they can kind of take over, they also have quite potential for doing damage themselves. So they can kind of take over rivers and kind of kill things off. So we might think about like how we might kill off all of kind of late capitalist computing, perhaps, through thinking with the microbe. So how might we open up the processes of execution to think about a kind of freer relation with these amazing deeds of microbes? How might we think about processes that can allow these amazing deeds of microbes to be realized in entanglements with computation? Is there a possibility there? That is how we might enable microbes to be able to exploit computing for the maintenance of its life, right? So not maintaining it, but for its own maintenance. And as Nigel Clark, the geographer, kind of suggests, how might we, when we're thinking about our relationships with the inhuman or the non-human, be able to generate novel forms and behaviours, be able to probe new pathways of possibility in order that they might proliferate themselves. So the Critter Compiler project is really a kind of experiment, and it's a speculative artwork that I've been kind of thinking with as a kind of response to this ethnographic work on microbial computing, in a way to kind of think about it otherwise, through perhaps a much unrulier process of computation. So in this project, the Critter Compiler exploits the heat generated by the execution of a neural network machine learning algorithm. And it literally, from this, produces a heat that allows algae to proliferate, to kind of to grow. It literally generates a kind of novel form. So as the computational process is executed, the central processing unit, the kind of CPU that we feel heat from, processes the activity of the algorithm running. So as you know, like when you're sat with your laptop on your lap, it's getting warm because of the algorithms running. The process is running. And so as this happens in the Critter Compiler project, the heat is emitted, and recursively as the algae pass through and over the CPU, they cool it, affecting its processing speed, which in turn affects the algae growth. And in the Critter Compiler, the algorithm, the machine learning algorithm that's running, is a writing algorithm. So it's learning to write a novella, a Victorian short novel. So I was trying to also think about how we might also work with machine learning in ways that perhaps are different from models of efficiency. So whereas the critter chips are harnessed in a semi-living state that signal toxicity, the Critter Compiler is a much more unruly multitude of algae microbes and computational processes. Whereas the critter chip is always proceeding towards harm for capital, here, perhaps, we can start to think about what a type of punk solidarity might be with microbial life in computing infrastructures. And this is, although this is a kind of fabulation, and much of the processes really of microbial life have nothing to do with us, right? They're inaccessible to us. And really, instead of approaching microbial life as a resource to measure and extract data from, how might we think about engagements with microbial life in ways that might generate this non-profit oriented experiments, to go back to Rosie Brodotti's proposal. So in the case of the Critter Compiler, the machine learning algorithm learns its writing style at a character-based level from George Eliot's novel Middlemarch, which is a novel often cited by Brodotti as a kind of study of provincial life, a meditation on the social and political justice. And for those of you who know George Eliot's work, she was also a translator of Spinoza, and this was the kind of work that she could do as a woman. In a different time, she would have been writing her own philosophy books. So therefore, while some machine learning algorithms might have been trained for efficiency and financialization, the Critter Compiler is very much trained by a novel that conveys how we live in a world where we're all bound by a huge web. And if one person pulls at that web, or if something pulls at that web, something else is affected. And that's very much at the heart of Middlemarch. That even the smallest or most everyday processes are connected to planetary flows, much like microbial life, and microbial life is part of that. And in addition, in the Critter Compiler, the characters are not all human, and the algae species, together with other lively non-humans, replace the human characters. And the audience participant becomes a kind of witness to this story that's unfolding. And really, it's a kind of project where kind of starting with the genealogy of injury, but not lingering there, but at the same trying to resist the production of ever new reparative fantasies. And I guess I'm getting to the end of my time, so I'm just going to go to some concluding thoughts. But of course, although the critter compiler seeks to open up spaces for critters to perhaps have a different relation with computational infrastructures, of course we can't fully apprehend or recognize what this articulation is taking place here. And in this way, this is why I kind of see this project as a speculative fabulation. And it's definitely a kind of step on the journey. You know, there's a lot more work to be done here. This is an illustration of an idea, and it's also not the perfect answer in any way to the problems that I'm trying to raise about environmental computation. But instead, it's a kind of experiment. It's a prototype, perhaps, of an otherwise that itself, of course, presents many problems and limitations. Okay, so go back to St. Octavia Butler. So in a way, what I've tried to outline here is this kind of set of provocations, and the critter compiler project is not really where the work ends or settles. But to go back to the wider project on animal hackers, I want to propose that to think with the animal hacker, and that's the animal hacker is able to both exploit, but is also a double bond. It's a kind of exploited by entity. Is not to imagine a sort of co-enacting between humans and non-humans. But instead, I want to think about, when we think about thinking with the animal hacker, as a force that emerges from computational ecology. So the animal hacker is a kind of emergent force. And to think with the animal hacker is to recognize it as a creative force. And as Nigel Clarke describes, it's a kind of force, a persistence from the mineral realm, right? So, this is a kind of inhuman, non-human creative force, the entanglement or the kind of conglomerate of the animal hacker. So that's to say that the animal hacker is not only an animal, but an entanglement of non-human ecologies, computations that include hardware, software, riverbanks, mud, transgenic processes, and so on. But it's also the recognition that the animal hacker is often an input prescribed to a computational system. So how might we think about it beyond being an input and as seriously part of these computational practices? So alongside kind of recognizing the inventiveness of non-humans and their creative force, I think the urgent project here, and it's kind of perhaps wider political contributions, is as part of that conversation, which I'm sure many of you are also involved with, and there's a community of thinkers around this, of thinking about how we reimagine those common technological narratives that Minotaurian subjects, such as women, queers, animals, are passively held in place by computing. So there's a kind of imagination that women's queers and animals are passively held in place by computing. And the solution to that, or the suggestion to that, has often been that the responsibility lies with the often white male designer programmer to make these worlds better, to allow us to speak back. However, what I want to say here is that I believe that approach will never be liberatory, as it again just reinstates the scene of benevolence, right? So instead of kind of thinking about this or trying to think about this responsibility of the designer programmer to make things better for us, actually we need to think about a much more of a queer revolt. We need to argue for the inventiveness of non-humans, but we also need to reconcile that there might be different stories of reciprocity between humans, non-humans, and computing infrastructures. That sometimes there is actually benefits or reciprocity that the non-human animals are experiencing within these dark scenes. So how do we call for a responsibility and accountability here, but also make space to recognize that computing emerges out of entanglements, of which humans and non-humans are lively participants? How can we ask for and make a recognition of this interdependence that could unleash the potentials for minoritarians, including non-human animals, to remake computation? Because how might we think about non-human animals themselves realizing computation for themselves? So what I'm proposing here, just to finish, is that we need to engage with environmental reparations from another place, from a more queer place, to approach what's beyond a kind of optimistic model that's meant to solve the problem of living, And we need to do this without just producing ever new fantasies or simplifying our kind of notions of repair. And some of that is what we see in current practices of environmental computing. So as someone like Claire Colbrick might say, we need to engage with our extinction. And we need to do this in a way which might change the way that we do computing or that we think about aesthetics in computing. And so the Animal Hacker Project really is about seeking a way to open up how we might engage with and recognize life or the possibility for life as innovative within environmental computing so that we might make it otherwise. And here we might turn once again to the story of the camera dodging sheep, right? These resistant sheep. Or the critter chips who are sometimes, in some ways, exploiting that scene of computation. The critter chips whose corporate reality is inventing a new type of computation, although at the same time is very harmful to it. These new moments of creativity and emergence that suggest there is other possibilities for life in which the technological is not an outside to environment, and how that might feed into a kind of queer politics of survival. And I'm going to finish there.
Thank you very much, Helen. What a pleasure. Bueno, temps per les preguntes. La Helen té un dispositiu de traducció, llavors podeu preguntar com us sentiu més còmodes. Així que endavant. Material ens ha donat per obrir preguntes, així que serà un plaer.
Thanks, Helen. How close? I'm going to ask a very basic thing, but how close is this idea of damaging a living thing with the idea of death? And I'm asking that because with normal scientific processes, it looks like sometimes are very cruel, and I'm speaking in the case of humans. They're very cruel in order to just get life longer. So, and now you said this very interesting idea of engaging with our extinction. That makes me think that perhaps some kind of being careful with not damaging has to do with just allowing to die. So I'm curious to better understand this idea of damaging and how this relates to just death.
Yeah, so I guess in kind of contemporary thought around thinking about the relationships between capital production and death has been quite an explored ground. And what I am trying to suggest with the damage and injury as something to linger with is that these processes are very drawn out, enduring processes. And I think that computation, it changes the kind of from necropolitics to this kind of mode of injury, like this kind of holding of entities in states of injury and endurance. Then, yeah, I mean, I guess we can start to, if we want, think about that in terms of human life or human endurance within the kind of Anthropocene era, and actually our kind of slow movement towards extinction or death. So for me, in a way, it's about paying attention to these states of damage and injury that are productive of capital, but also are kind of semi-living states. In the case of the critter chip or the microbe, it's held in a semi-living state for as long as possible, so that its injury can be productive of capital. And so I guess you were saying to kind of have a simple answer about damage, and that was quite a complicated one. But yeah, for me, there's also the kind of, I think in like queer theory and queer practices and queer politics, there's also a kind of energy from actually acknowledging that damage and that harm, and then like how then we might kind of use that energy as a kind of affirmative creative force that could propel something different that's perhaps kind of urgently needed. So yeah, sort of also sort of thinking about like acknowledging that damage, but thinking about how we might kind of work with its energy in a way.
I was thinking, maybe following your question, that like maybe what's more interesting to think about that is what it means to be a living being, and like in a way, like who's not damaged in here. So probably being damaged is the condition of being a living being. So to me, damage brings me more to living than death. I don't know if you follow me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great, really great kind of observation and connection to make, that, you know, perhaps there's something about this kind of life which is like flowing through us is, always coexisting or kind of productive of damages towards something, but and how that kind of shifts also how we understand life or liveliness as well, or what the possibility for having a life is, to acknowledge that life is kind of full of these damages.
I was thinking about it, well, to the relation, because in this Anthropocene damage scenario in which we are finding ourselves and trying to think also about strategies to deal with, well, the perspective of the extinction, and how do we accompany ourselves and our non-human kins and building infrastructures and all that. How can we, maybe we should rethink, or does it, is it useful to rethink about struggle anymore? Can we think about how to use also these other ways of making kings and work with other non-human to think about the possible struggle strategies, or do we have to just learn how to go through and go toward this extinction? It's like a doubt that I have in the last few weeks. Okay. Thank you very much. For sure.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I guess the future towards the possible extinction is no doubt going to be a kind of scene of struggle for many of us, I would imagine. And so I think, you know, you're really right to kind of draw attention to that, to like how we might like think with struggle also as part of a generative force. And I guess as well, I mean, for me, also kind of the post-human work, or that kind of trying to break down the humanities as it's existed for so long, with the kind of human at the centre of it in our concerns, is really part of that struggle. And I kind of, that's, still where there's so much work to be done in a way. But of course, kind of like the current, the paying attention to the current need for other types of political struggle or revolt or resistance seems super urgent. But I'm not sure, maybe also you have an idea about whether we should continue to struggle or kind of party out to the end. Is that the and I guess it's interesting, isn't it? Because there have been some, environmentalists have kind of suggested that, to just party out to extinction. And I always think, party for who, right? Because like the rest of us probably don't even get that opportunity to party. Well, we do, but in other ways.
That could be a good option, actually, to go parting through that. But I'm not sure if we should just leave the idea of struggle against it and just struggle through it. But I haven't got a proposal or solutions or ideas, or where I'm just wondering if we are like we need to do that shift, or just also because, well, there is also this reticency to abandon all the structure of thinking that plan and the struggle and solution in a very human way, and it's also a way to respond to those way of thinking. Yeah, but yeah, I think
I think it's that ongoing tension, isn't it, between how we still have some, and I am myself, I'm kind of aligned with these like utopianist thinkers like Lauren Ballant or Donna Haraway, and there is some kind of hope there, right, for some partial, like, because we were talking about in the workshop, a kind of partial reparation or perhaps some changes. But I guess there's also that kind of tension of how we might do these practices of struggle repair, or kind of designing for repair in ways that are perhaps do them differently or do them otherwise, and don't kind of reimpose those kind of normative structures. I think that for me, it's not an easy thing to, it's not an easy thing to practice, right? But I'm kind of continually thinking about that tension. Whether that's in, so like the work that we do as Citizen Sense, which is much more kind of direct action, work with communities who are affected by pollution or polluting properties, who actually, in that work, there's the way in which kind of dealing with that tension, often we do kind of go, we utilize or instrumentalize these normative structures of science to help make, give them some resources to make change, or that they can make change with. So I think there's that holding that tension there. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm not ready to give up the struggle yet either.
Ok, bueno, pues si no hi ha moltes preguntes ho deixem aquí. Moltes gràcies a la Helen, ha estat un autèntic plaer i crec que segurament a totes les que estem aquí ens ha obert, no?, com una multiplicitat de preguntes que s'han de treballar, no sé si des de la lluita, però potser des de la col·laboració. Això, que moltes gràcies, gràcies a totes per venir, gràcies també a totes les persones que a nivell tècnic han fet possible això, també al Quim, que està fent la traducció, i volia aprofitar també per recordar que algunes de les qüestions que han sortit ara a la proposta de la Helen estaran presents en un parell d'activitats que tenim en GAR properament. Una és aquesta setmana, que és un taller amb la MACBA, que podeu consultar la informació al web d'en GAR, i també un taller que farem el 18 de novembre amb Quimera Rosa. I crec que continuarem, la Helen ens ha obert aquí una multiplicitat de qüestions que continuarem abordant. Moltes gràcies.